Hey all, Dr. Garrett here along with Dr. Harbison, and we have something new for you today. We have a video component. Weird, right? Online teachers and no video component. Thus far, we've done everything audio, but we're going to switch it up a little bit this week and use the video component in an effort to talk about some movement technique. And we've done a few of these videos in the past, so we'll make sure that we add a link to the website with these resources in the description or in part of this post here. But we wanted to take a few moments to discuss a movement today, and that movement is the kettlebell swing. There's a few different reasons why we've chosen this one, but we often talk about in our classes the squat, the bench press, and some of the more the deadlift and pull up. Those are even two movements that we talked about in the previous videos, which are a little bit more, I wouldn't say obscure, but that doesn't get as much attention, perhaps, at least the pull up. But we wanted to add to that list of exercises, and we have chosen the kettlebell swing. It's one of my favorites, especially transitioning out of a traditional gym setting these days and having or doing more of the manual labor type stuff. I don't have access to a gym, so this is a great way for me to still get some resistance training in and kind of challenge my posture and position more or less. So in the previous videos, we've gone through the exercise's purpose, the variations, some of the common errors, and then loading, or kind of like how to progress through with this exercise. So for you, Dr. H, what is the purpose, or what are some benefits of the kettlebell swing?
Well, one of the things you mentioned just right there is in terms of moving away from a gym setting. One of the nice things as far as the purpose of it, it's a way we can load a hip hinge pattern. But you don't have to have a ton of equipment to do it. You can have a kettlebell. It doesn't take up much space, and right now with a lot of people not being able to get into a gym or not having gym access due to the pandemic, it can be a great way to get some activity in just locally at your own house or in your backyard or whatever. So to your point though, the purpose, again, loaded hip hinge, it's hip flexion extension, working the hip extensors primarily and the spinal erectors in the trunk. So you talked about posture, and there's certainly a role to be played there. It's a posterior chain dominant exercise. So we're talking primarily hamstrings, glutes, low back. But the dynamic aspect of it is kind of an interesting piece as well. In that we're trying to produce a decent amount of force and speed with this, not just a slow, grindy hip extension like in the deadlift, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
So we get some dynamics in there. But yeah, it's the posterior dominant fashion, or the aspect of the movement that's posterior chain dominant. We can talk about how that kind of maybe moves into sport and life. That's certainly a key aspect in a lot of sports, is that violent hip extension. And so there's certainly some elements there that would have some carryover to a lot of sports.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what I see as the purpose. Any differences or things you want to add there?
Yeah, I think even though it is a posterior dominant movement, it's still a compound exercise, which means that we're using multiple joints. And I think that helps develop a great sense of coordination. As simple of a movement as it is, and we'll show you a demonstration here in a second, but as simple as it looks, man, if you've been in a gym setting, you've seen some wild variations of this stuff. And we'll talk about that when we get to the errors. But I think it's just it's a simple, effective, and relatively safe way to begin to develop some coordination, particularly between the upper and the lower half through the hips. And so like when I talk about the trunk or the core, we think about our abs oftentimes, but I think the hips play such a pivotal role in the core to me. And so, and I know we've talked about this and agree here, is that the hip is really what kind of connects, and the trunk connects the upper and lower halves. And so it's a great exercise for developing some coordination there. The other thing I have here is that it's portable. Like, you can take it anywhere. I just went on a vacation for a wedding, and I took the kettlebell with me because I didn't know, I knew we weren't going to have access to gyms, just like you said, because of everything going on, but I didn't want to have an excuse not to do anything. And so, man, you throw a kettlebell in there and you can literally do anything. You can do single joint, so you can do curls, you can do compound exercises of the upper body, focusing on compound exercises of the lower body. You can throw a little run in there, and you can do all kinds of variations, and we'll show some of those as well. and they become pretty advanced, and maybe more than most people need. An argument could be made, but I just appreciate the coordination that it develops. It's a great conditioning tool as well, a conditioning tool with some external resistance. So, obviously you're not going to be running, but man, you swing a kettlebell 25 to 40 times in one sitting for one set, you're going to develop an elevated heart rate for sure. So I think for those three things are in addition to yours, some benefits, or the reason why I include kettlebell training into my routine.
Yeah, I really like that we brought up the fact of, or the idea of kind of the coordination around the hip. I think that's, I mean, we talked about this before, and I think we'll get into this here with this movement in particular, but learning how to do a hip hinge with kind of the coordination aspect of what is the trunk doing and how do we avoid spinal flexion and maintaining a neutral spine under load and all that. Like it's a learned pattern for sure. So there's some coordination there, but the application of that goes in so many different directions. So I really like that point that you brought up. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, like if I'm thinking about a transfer of movement, like the most common one that it would be, or the most straightforward, would be a jump, because we're bringing our hands down and back, and then we're violently flexing at the shoulder while extending at the hip to try to jump as high as possible. So I think as far as like a transfer, that's like straight away the most common, but it's just at the end of the day, it's still the coordination, development, and the development of violent hip extension, which is seen in a lot of different activities. So let's take a peek at what a kettlebell can look like. I got a couple different angles here. So I'm going to share this piece. Can you see this all right?
Yep.
Okay. So this is just a front view, a couple repetitions of this is what would be considered a standard or a Russian kettlebell swing. Of course, the bar is in the way there, so you can't really see the knees. There it goes. Of course. let me show that one more time here. See if this bar can get out of the way. There we go. So you'll notice that there's not like a huge bend at the knee. There's certainly some flexion and extension going on, but as we switch views, you're going to see that it is quite hip dominant, and ultimately the hands are following the hips. As the hips are extending, the hands are elevating. As the hips are flexing, the hands are now kind of coming into in between the leg there. So let me share the other version. Here we go from a side view, which might be a little bit better here. Can we see this here? All right. So here we're seeing the hips driving back. The knees again are bending, but we're not squatting here. So it's more of a vertical shin look. And then as the hips go back, the hands go back. As the hips come forward, the hands come forward. And again, the hips are really driving the exercise here more than anything else. Nice neutral spine, and we're aiming for that in general in most all of our movements. So let's talk variation. That's the basic right there. A Russian kettlebell swing, 2 hands on the bell, hips back, hips forward. Our hands are following that violent, or that concentric and eccentric phase. Eccentric phase, the hands are coming down. Concentric phase, the hands are elevating. And the hands are elevating because our hips are driving and producing force and creating momentum to swing the kettlebell up. So Russian swing, both hands on the bell. American swing, we're going to get the kettlebell up over the head. Pros and cons, or maybe not necessarily cons, but there's reasons to do that. And then from there, it can get.
What are those reasons for you?
Well, I think as far as if we're looking for competition purposes, as I generally would define CrossFit's effort to standardize a movement, I think the purpose is just to get to an endpoint. Whereas a Russian kettlebell swing may be more, I don't think it would be, but perhaps it's more subjective. Like everyone's chest level is different. But if everyone has to get to where their humerus is at their ear, then we have a start and a stop point. And so if we're trying to give it a kind of a definition, I guess, an American swing is a full range. It's going to, drastically fatigue the shoulders a lot more. It's also more time under tension, so it's going to challenge the grip. So as far as a movement in competition, I think it's best for perhaps a start and a stop point. And then as far as the training goes, it's just more time under tension. It's a greater range of motion. That doesn't make it better or worse. It's just is. What about you?
Yeah, I think it's an important note to kind of bring up the fact that that came about mostly because of CrossFit and the need to standardize a start and stop point to be able to assess, was that a full rep or was it not? Because I mean, if you do a Russian style swing, really the arms aren't involved at all. It's hip extension, and if the bell comes up to your belly button or your sternum, it doesn't matter. And generally the experts are below kind of a horizontal humerus. It's pretty minimal shoulder flexion involved. So yeah, to your point, bring it all the way up to a full, humeral lockout at the top is to standardize that. So I think one of the cons that we should mention with that, though, is the potential for glenohumeral impingement at the top. It's certainly a possibility, especially if you're doing a lot of reps of that. It's something to be careful with. Anytime you have overhead athletes, you have to be concerned with impingement of the shoulder. So there are some potential cons there in turning the movement into more of a upper body movement than it was originally designed to be. I think it's important just to note that there are different movements. They're used differently, and like you said, it doesn't make one necessarily better or worse. Just to understand that they are different, and we are certainly incorporating more shoulder flexion with the American style versus a pure hip flexion and extension with the Russian style.
Yeah, and I think it lends itself, again, if we're talking about this being a conditioning tool, you'll see upwards of 50 swings in a set. And so when fatigue takes, what's that?
I've seen upwards of 200.
Yeah, in a set. So when you get fatigued and you have to go all the way up here, there's just more chance for error. Again, it doesn't mean that it's the wrong way. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do an American swing. My wife prefers the American swing. She always looks at me like I'm doing half reps, and she always gets bitter at me like, he's not going all the way up. But that's kind of how she was trained, and she's more accustomed to that. And again, it doesn't make it right or wrong. It's just a different style. And
what about the kind of overloaded eccentric component? If you got more room for the bell to fall, there's an additional eccentric component there for that.
Sure. But maybe that's a good thing too. If you're doing it with good form, that's again more time under tension. So it's like, so if you're doing it with good form, great. If you're doing it bad form, then no good. But that's not a surprise. Like, we should be doing these things with good technique regardless. So as far as variations though, you can throw two hands on it. You can do a Russian swing, an American swing. You can do single arm kettlebells, single arm kettlebell swings. I wouldn't do a single arm American, but single arm swings. And there's just so much variation outside of just the grips as well. And we'll transition to that, to the other video here where it shows a minute of variations here. So I'll share this screen. Let's see here. And we'll just show some folks different things that you can do. So there's different combinations that you can throw as well. It just is in general, a great tool. Now, what we're seeing here is certainly advanced. I want everyone to understand that. And the other thing people should note is the weight of the kettlebell as well. But this is a great way to move through multiple planes of motion. We're flexing and extending at the shoulder, but at the lower half of the body, we're rotating, working through the transverse plane. So it has great potential for movement through space as well, as we're seeing here in this walking pattern. But again, these are certainly advanced exercises. So this is not our default here. Day one, we're not doing this. But again, of important note is the weight of the kettlebell as well. But I like the lateral movement here. Again, more rotation here. So it's just very versatile, essentially. And the variations really are endless. You just want to make sure that you're using as safe a technique as possible, of course. But I got to be honest with you, swinging a kettlebell is boring. That is one potential downfall to just a simple two-handed Russian swing. Man, it gets old real quick. So it's great that
Just doing a sagittal plane version, you
Yeah,
mean?
just doing a sagittal plane version. But the thing is the kettlebell in itself is so valuable. And the fact that you can swing it and do so many different things with it is
Yeah.
what really, it's an opportunity to be creative at the very least.
Yeah, I was thinking that, 'cause as you were saying that, I mean, I feel like it's much easier to be versatile with multi-planar movements with a kettlebell than it is with a barbell, for example.
100%.
So while you can get boring just sagittal plane flexion extension, doing incorporating rotational aspects and the swinging aspects in different planes and movements makes it a lot more fun, I think. So
Yeah, for sure. And again, you just get to be creative in your exercises. So um, we got some purpose and benefits. We got some variations. What are some errors? We've kind of alluded to some of these, overextension of the spine as we get to the top, whether it's American or a Russian swing. Some other common, like the foundational errors that we commonly see are that you would note in a deadlift or any other movement where you see a significantly rounded back or protracted shoulders where they slouch forward. What are some of the more subtle differences that you've seen or subtle errors that you've seen?
yeah, I think it's important with errors to mention, kind of rule number one would be spinal safety. Anytime you're dealing with hip
Mm-hmm.
flexion exercise, loaded hip flexion, neutral spine's paramount. So
Mm-hmm.
that's probably step number one. For me, the two main things I see when I observe people doing kettlebell swings at in a gym, a public gym setting, the two biggest errors I see are number one, squatting it rather than hip hinge,
Mm-hmm.
and then number two would be turning it into an arm swing movement rather than just when we talk about the Russian style kettlebell swing, it's just the arms aren't doing anything; they're along for the ride, and
Mm-hmm.
you oftentimes will see experts kind of having I call it like a T-Rex arm, like a hinged or flexed elbow, to kind of further minimize any desire to when the arms are straight, there's more of a ability to kind of use the traps and the shoulder flexors to throw the weight up there. And really, like I said, it's the whole point of it is that you're just flexing and then powerfully extending the hip. The arms aren't doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so when we talk about the other error being squatting, like I mentioned earlier in the video, the element of a loaded hip hinge is a learned pattern. We have to spend some time learning and teaching people if they're new to the movement, how do you hinge the hip under load without squatting? Because that's typically one of the first things people do is when you say, okay, keep your back straight, but then hinge at the hip, they keep their back vertical
Mm-hmm.
rather than straight. So we can keep the back straight even if it's horizontal.
Mm-hmm.
So learning how to hinge at the hip while still keeping the back neutral, we'll say, maybe that's a better word rather than straight. So a neutral spine rather than a vertical spine. There's an
Mm-hmm.
important distinction there. But that's one of the things I'll commonly see is people will be squatting the weight. So a lot of knee flexion, and you don't see the hips traveling back as much, and then you don't get as powerful of an extension either.
Mm-hmm.
When you push the hips back and forward, there's a real kind of a pop at the end of the movement.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that in the video that you showed us of you performing the movement, is there's a real powerful kind of terminal phase of the extension to really kind of lock the glutes in. And I think that's a big part of that last phase of the movement is squeeze the glutes
Mm-hmm.
to lock out that extension piece without hyperextending the lumbar spine, of course.
So would you say squatting it is basically another way of saying it would be more knee dominant? So the violence is going to come, or the pop, if you will, is going to come from the knee extension rather than the hip extension. But this movement really should focus on the hip extension rather than the kney extension,
Yeah,
especially because it's such a large muscle group, and we have the hamstrings and the glutes coming in in an effort to develop this power. We have a great opportunity to train these large muscle groups rather than focusing perhaps on the quads with this more like squat dominant technique.
for sure. And
So
I think you also see those two errors I pointed out. I think they go hand in hand oftentimes.
yeah, yeah.
If you squat the weight, the only way to get the kettlebell swinging out in front of you is to use shoulder flexion. You can't
Because you're traveling up and down rather than front to
right.
back almost.
Yeah,
And yeah, I think one other thing that I noticed that is the trifecta of all this is that it's a lot slower. It's not like the kettlebell swing should be very like control and then violence, control, violence. And the squat is kind of this up and down, flowing. It's like a constant movement rather. I got to be careful how I say it because it's all constant movement. But I think you know where I'm going with this. The squat is almost one note, whereas the hip dominant is a control, again, with some explosion in there. So I'll show what the squat dominant looks like here. So the setup can start squatting, but notice how much further the knees travel forward too. So her knees are going almost past her toes. The butt is sinking down rather than pushing back.
Mhm.
Now, like, this is
This
still
one's
safe. It's not
one
like
is
it's unsafe in that it's, what's that?
I was trying to find worse examples. That one's not terrible. It's
No.
kind of halfway between. There's some hip movement there, but I see others, especially with the lighter the weight. It seems to me that's used, the more people will tend to squat it
Uh-huh.
for whatever reason. Um, but and so yeah, I've seen much worse than that, but that's certainly a good example of how the knee flexion and extension or greater knee flexion can cause problems with that movement.
Right. So we're seeing there's still, so knee, it's not like we're saying keep the knees straight. We're not saying that at all. This is essentially a dynamic RDL. Like I feel like it's the toughest thing. And you were talking about this with Boyle, is I feel like the RDL is like the simplest movement, but also the hardest to teach at the same time. Because in reality, it's a soft bend at the knee and then push the hips back as far as you can. Whereas, so can you see my mouse cursor here? So in the other video, the hips were down almost where this kettlebell is, rather than the hips being pushed back, and the knees were traveled much further past the toes. Whereas here, it's very simple. So let's get to there. So the furthest back point, my hips are back as far as they can go, neutral spine out through the head. And then as we drive up, the hips are just violently coming through. Whereas in the squat here, let's go back to that one. Let me see. Oh, technology. Going back to the squat, will show how much lower the hips are.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can slow that down. It's not going to let us. But I want people to focus on the hips here and how low they drop rather than how far they shoot back. But you can see this is just this is a soft hip position to me, and it's like very knee dominant. And if we translate this exactly to, we say it's a squat kettlebell swing, but I would be concerned if people's squats were like this. This to me doesn't look like there's a lot of hip activity here. It looks
Yeah.
like it's knee dominant, and we need to be cautious of that when we're squatting as well.
Yeah.
Because now a lot of the stress is placed on the knee rather than having some focus in the hips here, which is a much larger
Yeah.
muscle group.
Well, I mean, you mentioned like the idea of kind of coaching this up as an RDL, which is how I would approach it as well. And when I coach an RDL, I'll have people get into a soft knee position. So flex the knee just a little bit, and then I tell them just keep it there. Don't flex the knee anymore. Just imagine that we've flexed the knee. Now that's in concrete. I don't want your knees moving anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, at the top of the movement, we're getting knee extensions. We get back into that, but you don't have to. I mean, again, if the purpose is violent hip extension and developing the hip extensors, which is what we're trying to do, I don't care if the knees are a little bit flexed the whole time, as long as you get full hip extension.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of how I start teaching the RDL. And one of the things you can transition that into is certainly the kettlebell swing. So soft knee, and it's just hip extension. So you would eliminate the possibility of a squat pattern. If I tell you to flex your knee and then keep it there, and you can use kinesthetic cueing, kind of putting your hand in front of the knee or whatever you want to do. You can use bands to kind of, if you have a band attached kind of behind the knee, so wrapping around posteriorly and then attached to something like a squat rack in front, if they flex the knee, the band's going to drop down their leg.
Mm-hmm.
If they keep it there, like there's just enough tension with a flexed, a soft knee, the band will stay there. That's one of the ways you could perhaps mess with that, or kind of use a kinesthetic cue to teach that. But I think we're getting at the same point in that don't get too much knee flexion involved.
Well, and to me, this is a good transition into loading, because I'm saying this with caution, but maybe one of a great way to learn this kind of hips back and forward, and we talked about this a little bit, is to start with a heavier load perhaps than you would. Like, I would almost put a heavier, I would consider putting a heavier kettlebell in someone's hand just to get them used to this pendulum type movement, rather than something so light that because what happens is if you give someone something very light, the body doesn't grasp the concept of the importance of this violent extension because it's so light that oh, I can just use my arms and this gets it done. So I wouldn't say,
It's
hey,
kind of like the what's the term? I forget the physiological term when we look at like which muscle fibers are activated. Like your body kind of preferentially moves through that sequence of firing where it's like we're going to start with type 1. If that
right.
doesn't get the job done, we're going to move to type 2, and it
Hmm.
kind of goes through that progressive nature. It's the same thing here where it's like if you use too light of a kettlebell swing, your body kind of intuitively knows I don't need to recruit the big muscles of the
Hmm.
hips. I can just throw this up with shoulder flexion. Whereas if you have a 60-pound kettlebell and you're not strong enough to shoulder flex 60 pounds, you
You
have
ain't
to.
shoulder flexing it. Yeah.
Exactly.
And that doesn't mean, here's the thing too, though, and this is where the coach's eye and common sense comes into play. I'm not gonna, if some 58-year-old that's never exercised comes in, I'm not gonna be like, hey, grab that two poot over there and we're gonna start swinging this thing for reps, right? Like I would, I wouldn't put the heaviest kettlebell ever in their hand, but I would put something more than perhaps I'd feel comfortable with them swinging 10, 15, 20 times.
And I
But it
would say
would be
this comes
to,
after a discussion around neutral spine, and
correct,
they've learned the pattern first.
right.
When we now begin to load it, don't go too light. This is more towards the advanced stage. We've learned the pattern. We know how to maintain neutral spine. Now, as we begin to load it, I think you're right. The error is in going too light, and I see that with
Mhm.
the squat shoulder flexion pattern, it's almost always using a weight that's too light.
And conversely, it's too heavy sometimes too. You got people that are, heave hoeing and hiking up this kettlebell that's way too heavy. So this is the common sense, the coach's eye. Don't be silly. Like, watch your client and watch yourself and feel it. Like, is this going to allow me to be successful? If you see them squatting too much, then maybe you want to put a heavier kettlebell in and just have them work on, hey, all I want you to do is bring the hips back and through. And maybe the range of motion to start is only here. But as they gain skill, it becomes this full, hips all the way hike through and then hands up, or hands hike through and then hands up to shoulder height. And
Would you say that? So if we say maybe a common error with too light of a kettlebell is typically in the squat shoulder flexion pattern.
mhm,
A too heavy one, I would say, kind of from visual experience and seeing a lot of these different movements, is too heavy a kettlebell. You're going to see a lot more hyperextension of the spine
yep,
and kind of using the upper body to kind of muscle
right,
things up rather than correctly kind of snapping that hip extension through.
yep. So
That's what I would.
loading, this is actually one time that I would say maybe start a little bit heavier, but I don't mean go through a full range of motion, and I don't mean to hit a ton of reps either. If we're trying to progress them to kind of feel this movement, you can start a little bit heavier, but if you're going to get them to do some volume, then the appropriate weight should be selected. So I feel like I'm not really saying what I'm trying to say here because I want there to be some weight, but don't overload it either.
Yeah, I mean, common sense there for sure. And like I said, like after you've learned how to hip hinge with a neutral spine, you should be able to safely begin loading. And
Mhm.
I would say the other thing I was going to mention, I'm drawing a blank. Sorry, forgot what I was going to say.
Anyways, I think though, again, as far as loading, man, load this thing up though, get heavy with it, and then it's not going to develop. To me personally, it's not going to develop the same amount of strength that overloading a barbell will. But it will certainly. It's certainly a great way to dynamically overload. I would say that. So I wouldn't have people jumping with a weight vest on, but this is a great way to mimic and add resistance to a jumping pattern. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but
So,
I remember what I was going to say. And I want to get your thoughts on this. Was as far as so when we talk about Russian versus American style, I would prefer that they learn Russian first because it's just hip extension, and then once they learn that pattern, okay, now we can start throwing in a greater range of motion with the upper body, perhaps.
mhm,
I think when we talk about loading and using a heavier weight, I would avoid using a lot of shoulder flexion first, because then we get into more of that tendency to use shoulder flexion rather
Mhm.
than hip extension as the primary engine behind this movement.
Mhm.
The other,
Absolutely.
okay,
That's that pendulum type
yeah,
exercise or that movement. So start small and it's just nice back and forth. This is one of those movements where you just need to feel the rhythm of it. Really, it's a very rhythmic movement, and that's why I'm saying it's a great way to develop coordination.
yeah.
But it's one of those things where once you do it right a couple times, you go, oh, that's the flow. That's it right there. I guess you could feel that too when you're squatting, but I feel like you feel that when you're squatting because it's too light, which is something we've already addressed.
I think another key that's always been a kind of a mental cue I always look to use is kind of the feeling of loading the proximal hamstrings,
Mm,
where you get a little bit of a hamstring, you maybe even a glute stretch
some
at
high hamstring. Yeah, yeah.
the flexion component.
Hmm.
Whereas if you're squatting that, you don't get that feeling at all. So it's the
No.
same as an RDL, where we're getting a little. We're not trying to maximally stretch the hamstrings, but just a little bit, and then that for me that helps kind of pop that hip extension into the concentric phase a little bit more.
Hmm.
It's like, all right, I feel a little bit of a load. It's like a stretch shortened cycle almost, where
Hmm.
like I'm going to load the hamstring proximally and then pop, like extend that into hip extension. The other thing I was going to ask you, as far as loading goes, high versus low reps, we've kind of alluded to the fact that people will use these for some conditioning or some high rep, 100 or 200 rep type sets. What are your thoughts there as far as when we load this movement? What are the applications of high versus low rep for the kettlebell swing?
It reminds me of your boy Bud Jeffries there. Yeah. So again, this is no different than barbell. If it's super heavy, then the reps are going to be lower. If it's super light, then the can be higher. The other thing too is I love comboing this with pull-ups and with push-ups and some other movements. So we've really just focused on a kettlebell swing, but you can do so much. I mean, even if you just hold a kettlebell in your hand for an extended period of time, man, you do 20 swings into 10 presses on each arm, into 10 bent rows on each arm, into 10 front rack squats, into 10 high pulls or whatever. I mean, man, that's like 60 to 100 reps just in one set that you can flow easily from one to the next to the next. But I usually I don't do any less than 10. I don't even I honestly I don't really do any less than 20 because all I have is a 55-pound kettlebell. So I don't to make it harder, I do single arm, but sometimes single arm, quite frankly, are easier. I know I'm not fully answering your question here, but as far as what rep range to work within, there's so much variance here to me that it's hard to say, well, you should do when you're using this weight or this percentage, do this many reps. So I'm kind of hesitant, I guess, to give that. What are you thinking?
I mean, I think the correct answer that I would say is it depends on the goal, and you
Sure.
alluded to that like in the beginning. So, what are you trying? What are you using it for? Are you using it for conditioning? All right, well, let's go some super high reps, or
Hmm.
incorporate some things that way. Are you using it to try and develop maybe some levels of strength in the hip extensors? Then we can go lower reps. So
Yeah.
that's the general answer I'd say. But
One,
the beauty is there's a big range that can be applied. So
one other thing that this does is that especially when you get into higher volumes, is it's a great way to help almost subconsciously teach the body how to maintain rigidity but breathe. And
mm,
that's another thing that when you're playing sports, you don't go down holding the eccentric and then blow out on the way up. You're kind of like constantly breathing while there's this tension and this isometric or even this push and pull activity going on. So this is a great way to brace the midsection, breathe while being dynamic as well.
great point. Yeah, I like
So
that.
just kind of random. I was thinking about that as far as it being a conditioning tool, man, when you get to you're not going to hold your breath for 200 reps and you're
Yeah,
not going to, I mean, there is a breathing component to it, but it's constant tension
yeah.
in reality. Whereas you can kind of like cheat that with the squat. You can,
All
and
right.
then when blow out and stand up at the top, you can kind of relax for a second and get a big, uh, you know, uh, inhalation of air. And so now I'm rambling, but it's a
Great.
great way to improve that component as well.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, that's all I've got on my end. Anything else you want to add on this one?
No, I think if you're looking for a great, tool that can be used anywhere, anytime, man, this is really has saved me as far as from a physical activity perspective. It saved me because otherwise push-ups get real boring. And I have a kettlebell. I mean, I literally have a kettlebell and a tree branch, and between those things, it's enough. I got pull-ups, I got body rows off that thing. I can do bent rows with the kettle. There's just the kettlebell is so versatile that it's a shame for it to not be in everyone's toolbox, is what I would say.
Cool to have, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. All right, well, thanks. Appreciate the insights here. This was fun.
See ya. Air 5. Can we do that? Like, all right.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. See y'all next time.